Go ahead and get comfortable. Settle in. Pull whatever blanket is nearest to you and just let the weight of the day start to fall off your shoulders. Feel the tension in your back, loosen a little. Adjust your pillow if you need to. Slow your breathing down. Because tonight, we are going to take our time. There is no rush here. This is a long one, and that is entirely by design. Everything we do on this channel is built for the hours when the world gets quiet, and your brain starts to finally slow down enough to actually receive something. And what we have tonight is worth receiving slowly and carefully. There is something almost paradoxical about the show we are going to talk about tonight. On the surface, it is a cartoon about a blue cat who goes to middle school in a town full of sentient office supplies, haunted houses with personalities, a talking cloud who throws lightning when she is emotionally dysregulated, a piece of toast who dies and comes back every episode, and a guidance counselor who is an ancient primate with what are very strongly implied to be recreational substance use habits. It is bright and noisy and fast and funny in that particular way. That Cartoon Network shows from the 2010s were funny. That rapid-fire visual gag layered on top of character moment, layered on top of reference humor style, that the network had more or less perfected by the time the show premiered. It aired on a network designed for Saturday mornings and after-school hours, aimed at kids who eat cereal by the bowlful and argue about which flavor of Gatorade is definitively the best, and occasionally throw things at their siblings. And yet here we are, probably somewhere between 10 at night and 3 in the morning, finding ourselves completely absorbed in it, finding ourselves thinking about it seriously, finding ourselves wanting to understand it properly. The Amazing World of Gumball ran from 2011 to 2019 across 6 full seasons and 240 episodes. It was produced at Cartoon Network Development Studio Europe, a building in London staffed by an international team of animators, writers, directors, and production staff who collectively decided that a children's show was the perfect vessel for some of the most ambitious storytelling, most philosophically loaded subtext, and most quietly provocative content in the history of the animated medium, and they were not wrong about that. They were absolutely, consistently right about it from the show's very first season through to its complicated, deliberately unresolved finale. But Gumball's journey from pitch to cultural landmark, from a folder of rejected commercial art to one of the most discussed animated shows of its generation, was not smooth. Over the course of its original run, and extending into the revival series that arrived in 2025 under the title The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball, the franchise accumulated a genuine collection of controversies. Not all of them are dramatic in the traditional sense. Some of them are quiet disagreements that simmered for years without ever boiling over. Some are full-blown community arguments that split the fandom into clear factions. Some involve Chinese food companies and brazen plagiarism. Some involve the mechanics of a zombie apocalypse episode that aired at 4 in the afternoon for 7-year-olds. Some involve children's voices deepening at the worst possible narrative moments. Some involve a movie that was announced, greenlit, publicly discussed by its creator, canceled by a corporate entity that had not made the thing but owned the rights to distribute it, and is still in some form of uncertain developmental existence as of the time we are recording this. What makes Gumball's controversies more interesting than most, more worth exploring in this depth and at this pace, is that they all connect back to the same central tension. This is a show that was always trying to do more than its format was supposed to allow. It was always pushing against the edges of what a children's cartoon was expected to be, expected to say, expected to contain. And every controversy, whether it was about censored content or global plagiarism or voice actor replacements or the show's relationship with death and depression and the fear of being forgotten, was really a controversy about what this show was, who it was genuinely for, whether it was possible for something rated for 7-year-olds to honestly be one of the most philosophically sophisticated programs on television, and whether the people making it had gone too far this time. They had not gone too far. That is the answer I will give you up front and defend for the rest of this script. But the debate was real and continues to be real, and it is a debate worth understanding in full. Tonight we are going to walk through all of it, every major controversy in the franchise's history. The creation story that most people either do not know or only know in broad strokes. The censorship battles fought across more than 30 countries, with 30 different sets of standards about what is appropriate for children's eyes. The infamous Chinese bootleg that was one of the most audacious acts of plagiarism in the history of animation. The voice actor changes that divided the fandom multiple times across the show's run. The episode that was so genuinely dark that parents still argue about whether it should have aired at all. The adult jokes debate. The cliffhanger that left an entire fan community stranded for years. The movie that came and went and remains somewhere in uncertain limbo. And the return that nobody was entirely sure was actually going to happen until it actually did, with all the new controversies that came with it. So settle deeper into wherever you are right now. Let your body get heavy and your eyes get soft. This is a long story, and every part of it is worth sitting with. We will get through it together, slowly and without rushing anything. If you are listening to this right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is where you are, drop a comment and tell us. Tell us the time and the place. I genuinely love knowing where these episodes end up. What time is it for you? What city? What country? What part of the world? And if this is your first time on the channel, the best thing you can do is subscribe. It takes 3 seconds and it ensures that everything we put out actually reaches you. Okay, let us get into it properly. Section 1. The birth of a show and the man who made it. There is a version of this creation story that gets told in broad strokes fairly often. Ben Bocklett had some rejected characters. He put them in a show. Cartoon Network liked the show. The show became a hit. That is the summary version. But the actual story, the granular version told from the beginning, is worth knowing in full detail because it shapes everything that came after, including every controversy we are going to discuss tonight. The controversies are not separate from the creation. They grow from the same soil. Benjamin Bocklett was born in Paris in 1980. He grew up in France before eventually relocating to London, where he completed his animation training and eventually landed a job at a studio called Studio, aka. Studio, aka was, and still is, one of the leading commercial animation houses in London. They produce advertisements, primarily, the kind that require a high level of technical and aesthetic execution. Carefully designed characters in carefully designed worlds doing carefully designed things, all in service of selling a product or communicating a brand identity. The work is demanding in a specific way. You have very little time to create something that has to be immediately legible, immediately appealing, immediately memorable. You build characters and worlds and visual languages for a 30-second or 60-second format, and the discipline that requires is its own kind of education in how animation works. Bocklett worked there for several years, learning the craft thoroughly, developing as a character designer and director. He created a lot of characters during his time at Studio, aka characters for pitches, characters for campaigns that were being developed for potential clients. He put genuine creative energy into these designs. He thought carefully about their personalities, their proportions, their visual logic. And then the pitches did not land, or the campaigns changed direction, or the budget was not there, and the characters were shelved. That is how commercial animation works. Most of what you create will never be seen. Most of the energy you put into a design will go into a drawer and stay there. You grieve it for a moment, and then you move on to the next pitch. By 2007, Bocklett had moved to a new professional context. Cartoon Network had established its European development studio in London, operating under the name Cartoon Network Development Studio Europe. This was a significant institutional commitment. Cartoon Network was investing in a European production infrastructure, building a team that could develop original content from scratch and bring it to the network. Bocklett was hired there as a development artist. His initial function was to help other creators develop and pitch their show concepts. He was there to support other people's ideas, to be a creative resource for the team's projects, not necessarily to lead his own development. The studio's model changed, however. A directive came down that every member of the team should develop and pitch their own original show concept. Not just assist others, but actively create something of their own and bring it to the network's attention. And Bocklett, faced with that opportunity, made a decision that seems obvious in retrospect, but would have required a certain kind of confidence or desperation, or both in the moment. He looked at the folder of rejected characters he had accumulated over the years at Studio, aka all those designs and personality concepts that had never found a home in any commercial context, and he thought about what to do with them. What he came up with was an idea simultaneously simple enough to explain in a sentence and strange enough to give a network executive pause. He would take all those rejected characters, the ones declared not suitable for any existing project, and he would put them together in a single place, a school, specifically a remedial school. a school for cartoon characters that had been deemed by some form of creative quality control to be not good enough for deployment in regular animated work. A place where the discarded and the overlooked and the fundamentally difficult to categorize could live out their lives in the company of other creatures who had nowhere else to go. He pitched it to the producers at Cartoon Network Development Studio Europe, and their response followed a specific pattern. Initial enthusiasm, genuine interest in the concept's originality, and then a significant objection. The concept was, in the producer's assessment, too sad. A show about characters attending a remedial school because they had been rejected as not good enough for regular animation. Children's entertainment about the experience of being deemed insufficient and unworthy. That is the premise of something that makes children feel quietly terrible about themselves, not the premise of a show that airs on a children's network at a time when parents are trying to get their kids to do homework or eat dinner or go to bed. Bocklet revised it. He kept the core architectural idea, which was the mismatched collection of characters from different visual traditions and different artistic styles, all coexisting in the same world. But he softened the framing and wrapped it in something familiar. A family sitcom structure. A mother and a father and 3 children navigating the ordinary, extraordinary chaos of suburban life in a town that happened to be populated by impossible creatures. The characters were still rejects in the deepest sense, still beings assembled from commercial work that had never made it to production. But the show that contained them was readable and warm and accessible at the surface level. It was something you could enjoy without knowing any of the meta-story. It was also something you could engage with on a much deeper level if you chose to, and the show was always building in both directions simultaneously. The way Bocklet named his characters is worth pausing on, because it tells you something specific about his creative instincts. Nicole, the mother, was named after his own mother. Richard, the father, was named after his own father. Anais, the youngest child, was named after his sister. Gumball, the protagonist, carries something of Bocklet himself in his DNA, a slightly chaotic, well-meaning, frequently self-defeating creative presence navigating a world that does not always make sense. Who cares more than he lets on and tries harder than he admits? And the family name, Watterson, was a tribute to Bill Watterson, the creator of Calvin and Hobbes. The choice of that name is loaded in a way that rewards thinking about. Bill Watterson is famously one of the most principled creative figures in the history of popular art. He made Calvin and Hobbes for 10 years, producing one of the richest and most beloved comic strips in the history of the form, and then he stopped. Not because he was running out of ideas, not because the strip was failing. He stopped because he valued the integrity of the work over the continuation of the commercial enterprise. He refused to license Calvin and Hobbes for merchandise, famously and consistently, because he did not want the characters reduced to objects on a shelf. When he was done telling the story he wanted to tell, he walked away from the enormous platform he had built, let the strip come to its natural conclusion, and retreated from public life. Bocklet named his characters after a man who chose to let his creation rest, who chose completion over continuation. And then he put those characters into a world where the worst thing that can happen to you is being forgotten, where the alternative to constant performance and constant relevance is oblivion. The family named for the man who willingly embraced obscurity lives in a world where obscurity means ceasing to exist. That irony is not accidental. Nothing in Gumball is accidental. The show was greenlit. It became the very first original animated series ever produced by Cartoon Network Development Studio Europe, which is notable in itself. This was the studio's inaugural production, the project that established what European-produced Cartoon Network content could look and feel like. It was produced in genuine partnership with multiple studios across different countries, primary development in London, post-production and CGI work at Studio SOI in Germany from the second season onward, with Boulder Media in Ireland handling work in the early seasons. It was an international production in a way that even now is relatively unusual for an animated television series. The visual design philosophy that Bocklet and his team landed on was unprecedented in the medium. Rather than painting or digitally generating the backgrounds for the show, the team used photographs of real locations, primarily around London and its surrounding areas, as the actual backgrounds for every scene. The fictional town of Elmore, California, sits on top of real British street photography. The characters exist in a world that is literally photographed from life, which gives the show this specific, uncanny quality. This sense that the animated creatures are guests in a documented reality rather than inhabitants of a purpose-built cartoon world. And then the characters themselves, layered on top of those photographic backgrounds, were designed and animated in entirely different visual idioms. Gumball and his immediate family are done in a fairly traditional 2D animated style, clean and expressive. Tina Rex, the school bully who is a genuine large dinosaur, is CGI rendered in 3 dimensions. The Robinson family, the Wattersons' neighbors, look like they were made by a puppeteer, stiff and slightly wrong in a way that becomes increasingly unnerving the more time you spend with it. Idaho the potato is stop motion, carrying the physical weight and slight roughness of clay animation. Sussy, a minor recurring character, is literally a live-action human chin filmed upside down with googly eyes attached to it. One of the most genuinely strange creative decisions in the history of animated television. None of these characters look like they belong in the same show, because on a fundamental level they do not. They come from different visual traditions, different creative contexts, different intended purposes. They are misfits not just narratively but aesthetically. The visual dissonance is the point. It is a direct expression of what the show is about on the deepest level. A world populated by beings who do not fit and have decided to make a home together anyway. The Amazing World of Gumball premiered on Cartoon Network on May 3rd, 2011. The response was warm but not explosive. The first season has a quality of a show still finding itself, still discovering what it can do and wants to do, still occasionally falling back on safe comedy beats when it could be taking more interesting risks. But the seeds were there from the start. The philosophical depth was there. The willingness to push against expectations was there. The ambition was there, even when the execution was not yet fully matching it. By the second season, the show had found its rhythm and begun to understand its own strengths more clearly. By the third, it was doing things in the animated medium that had genuinely not been done before. By the fourth and fifth seasons, The Amazing World of Gumball was operating at a level of creative complexity that regularly outpaced what was being made for adult audiences on prestigious cable drama channels. That is not hyperbole. That is what the record shows. But the ambition came with friction. And friction was where the controversies began. The first thing to understand about Gumball's controversies, the foundational principle that makes sense of all of them, is that most of them were not accidents. The show was always aware of what it was doing. When it pushed against the limits of its TVY7 rating, it did so deliberately, with full knowledge of what it was getting away with and careful calculation of how far it could extend before a wall appeared. When it explored dark themes, it did so with intention and craft, not out of negligence or ignorance. When it embedded adult references into its comedy, it did so with precision and a specific kind of respect for its audience's intelligence. The controversies were not the result of a careless creative team stumbling into inappropriate territory. They were the result of a team that was constantly, deliberately, and thoughtfully testing the perimeter of what their format allowed. That posture, that knowing and premeditated approach to transgression, is what separates Gumball's controversies from the scandals of lesser shows. You are not going to find accidents here. You are going to find a team that knew exactly what they were doing, believed it was the right thing to do, and did it anyway. Section 2. The Voice Actor Controversy. This one begins quietly and grows into something genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, because it sits at the intersection of art and the unavoidable biological reality of what happens to children who are employed to make art over the course of years. Gumball Watterson is a 12-year-old cat. He sounds like a 12-year-old throughout the entire run of the show, maintaining that acoustic consistency across a production that ran from 2011 to 2019, required in the English language version 4 different children to voice the character across the show's run. Logan Grove voiced Gumball in the first 2 seasons and into the early episodes of the third. Jacob Hopkins took over partway through Season 3 and held the role through most of Season 5. Nicholas Cantu stepped in during Season 5 and voiced the character through Season 6 and the subsequent Gumball Chronicles miniseries. And then, Alkayo Thiele took over the role for The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball, which premiered in 2025. Darwin's voice trajectory was nearly identical. Kwesi Boaki voiced him in the earliest seasons. Terrell Ransom Jr. stepped in around the same time. Hopkins came aboard for Gumball and held the role until the same episode transition. Danielle Hansley Jr. took over alongside Cantu and carried the role through the original series conclusion. Hero Hunter now voices Darwin in the revival. The reason this is a controversy rather than simply a production note is multi-layered, and each layer tells you something different about the show's relationship with its audience. The transition from Logan Grove to Jacob Hopkins is the foundational moment in this history, the one that set the template and established the emotional stakes. Logan Grove had developed into the role of Gumball, with a specificity that made his voice feel genuinely inseparable from the character. His delivery carried something particular, a specific quality of dry exasperation disguised as confidence, occasionally cracking to reveal the sweetness underneath, that felt exactly calibrated to who Gumball was. And then puberty arrived, and Logan's voice began to deepen and roughen in ways that the production could not simply adjust around. A decision had to be made. What makes this transition remarkable is not that it happened, but how it was addressed. Rather than simply swapping the voice actor quietly between seasons and hoping fans would adjust without comment, the production chose to make the transition an explicit narrative event. The third season opened with an episode called The Kids, which built its entire story around the voice change happening within the fiction of the show. Gumball and Darwin wake up, and their voices have changed. They spend the episode processing this, finding ways to make the most of whatever time they have before they are no longer the voices people recognize, trying to stay in the moment of childhood even as something fundamental shifts. And then, in the episode's final moments, the universe resets itself, snapping back to younger voices, as new actors take over the roles with tones that sound like earlier versions of the characters. The episode works as a story about growing up. It works as a meditation on the impermanence of childhood and the specific grief of knowing that a phase of your life is ending. It also works, for anyone who understood what was happening in production terms, as a remarkably honest acknowledgement of the reality that this show, like all shows built on children's voices, was fighting a biological clock that it could not defeat. The universe resets the voices in the kids the same way it resets injuries and consequences across the episodic structure of the show, as if to say, we know this does not make perfect logical sense, but it makes the kind of emotional sense that the show requires. Fan reaction to Jacob Hopkins when he took over was not uniformly welcoming. There is a long and detailed record in fan forums and review communities from 2014 and 2015 of the debate about whether Hopkins's Gumball captured the specific qualities that Grove had established. Some fans adjusted quickly and came to prefer Hopkins's slightly rougher, more assertive interpretation. Others spent multiple seasons wanting the Grove era back. This is a normal phenomenon in long-running productions, but Gumball made it more charged by addressing the change so directly in the narrative. The show had essentially asked its audience to engage with the transition as a meaningful story event, and that invitation created a framework in which fans felt justified in having strong opinions about whether the new voice served the story properly. The Hopkins to Cantu transition in Season 5 handled things differently, and many fans felt the handling was inferior. Rather than a whole episode centered on the change, the transition happened as a quick gag at the very end of The Copycats, an episode primarily concerned with something else entirely. The show made a brief visual and audio joke acknowledging that new voices had arrived, and then the episode ended. After the relative emotional and narrative investment of the kids, a throwaway end-of-episode gag felt to many fans like a downgrade in the care and ceremony being applied to an event that mattered to them. Nicholas Cantu's vocal performance as Gumball divided the audience more sharply than Hopkins's had. Some listeners found it perfectly capable, a solid rendering of the character that served the episodes well. Others found it slightly lacking in the emotional texture that Hopkins had brought to the role in his stronger episodes. Jacob Hopkins had been particularly praised for his musical numbers, and his singing voice had actually influenced the writing in the fourth season, with the writers inserting additional song moments to take advantage of that skill. The shift to Cantu removed that specific musical dimension from the character's toolkit for a period. What is important to acknowledge alongside these assessments, and what does not get discussed enough in fan community debates, is the human dimension of what these transitions involved. Logan Grove was 12 when he started voicing Gumball. He put real craft into the role. He watched recordings of existing episodes to understand the character before taking over, developing a performance from the inside out. And then puberty ended his time in the role. Not a creative decision, not anything he controlled or could have changed. The same was true of Hopkins. The same was true of Cantu. These were young people who did genuinely good creative work, and then were replaced not because the work was inadequate, but because their bodies changed. Nicholas Cantu went on to significant acting success after his time with Gumball, most notably voicing Leonardo in the 2023 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem film, which was widely praised. Logan Grove, Jacob Hopkins, and the Darwin actors all continued working in various capacities. But the Gumball rule, which required them to sound perpetually 12 years old, was always going to be finite, and that finitude was baked into the premise from the day the show began. The revival series The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball brought an almost entirely new voice cast for the main characters. Alkayo Thiele as Gumball, Hero Hunter as Darwin, Kinza Syed Khan as Anais. Teresa Gallagher and Dan Russell returned as Nicole and Richard, respectively, which provided two anchor points of continuity that many fans found genuinely comforting and important. When your cast has turned over so thoroughly, having even two familiar voices from the original series creates a bridge across the gap that is more emotionally significant than it might initially seem. The fan debate about whether the new voices worked continued through the revival's first season in 2025. The majority view, reflected in the show's review scores and in the general tenor of fan discussion, was that Alkayo Thiele's Gumball was a genuinely strong piece of voice acting, capturing something real about the character even without the accumulated audience familiarity that the original actors had built up. But minority voices in the fan community maintained that something essential had been lost, that the specific chemistry of the original cast was not fully reproducible, and that the revival, however competent, was necessarily a different thing than what it was trying to continue. This is a debate without a clean resolution. Voice acting chemistry is partly about the performance and partly about the relationship between the listener's experience and the voice they are hearing. For fans who grew up with Logan Grove or Jacob Hopkins or Nicholas Cantu as Gumball, no subsequent voice is going to carry the same weight simply because the associations built up over years of listening cannot be transferred. This is not a failure of the new actors. It is a function of how intimacy with a performance works, and it means the voice actor controversy is one that will never fully close, only gradually diminish as new listeners come to the revival series without the accumulated context and simply hear Alkayo Thiele as Gumball because he is the Gumball they know. There was also, separately and somewhat oddly, a controversy in July of 2025 when the first full trailer for The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball was released. Multiple viewers noted that the voice of Gumball in the trailer did not sound like the Alkayo Thiele who had been announced as the series lead. Thiele himself confirmed through social media that he had not recorded the voice used in the trailer, without explaining why. The production did not provide a comprehensive explanation for the discrepancy. This created a brief but pointed moment of fan confusion and concern about transparency in casting and promotion, a small but telling controversy about the relationship between the production and its audience's desire for clarity. The show eventually premiered with Thiele in the role, and the performances were warmly received, but the trailer incident sits in the record as a strange moment of opacity from a show whose entire philosophical DNA has always been about honesty and self-awareness. Section 3. The Censorship Files. This is where we settle in properly, because the censorship history of The Amazing World of Gumball is one of the most comprehensive and instructive records in the history of children's television. It spans more than 30 national markets, touches on legal frameworks for broadcast standards in multiple regions, and reveals in specific detail exactly what different cultural systems consider too much for children's eyes. Reading through it is like taking a very slow, very detailed tour of global assumptions about childhood, innocence, and the appropriate boundaries of entertainment. Let us begin with the geography, because the scale tells you something important. Over the course of its original run, The Amazing World of Gumball was officially censored or altered for broadcast in the following markets: Africa, Australia, Brazil, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, India, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latin America, the Middle East and North Africa, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, the Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Russia, Serbia, Slovenia, Southeast Asia, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Taiwan, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. The United States also applied specific edits in certain periods and for certain episodes. That is more than 30 distinct markets, each with their own editorial history, their own specific list of cuts and alterations, and their own particular set of episodes that were modified or banned entirely. The most extensive and systematic censorship applied to the MENA region, which is the Middle East and North Africa market. The editorial standards applied in this market resulted in an enormous number of episodes being either substantially cut or prohibited from broadcast entirely. Understanding why requires understanding the framework being applied. In markets where Islamic law governs social norms around public entertainment and children's content, a set of standards applies that differs fundamentally from what is used in Western markets. Premarital romantic relationships between characters are considered inappropriate for depiction in content aimed at children because such relationships are considered haram, meaning forbidden under Islamic legal tradition. This single standard, applied consistently, generated an enormous list of content requiring removal. The episode called The Romantic, in which Gumball and Penny are the central romantic focus, was banned outright. The Choices, a deeply beautiful episode that depicts the romantic history of Nicole and Richard, was banned because it showed romantic interaction between characters before they were married, even though the episode is ultimately about commitment and love. The Matchmaker, which deals with Darwin and Carrie developing romantic feelings for each other, was banned. The Love, which is the show's Valentine's Day episode and therefore centered on romantic themes by definition, was banned. The comic was banned because Gumball appears in his underwear, which constitutes immodest dress under the applicable standards. The Astrological was banned for romantic themes. The Girlfriend was banned for romantic themes involving Darwin and a classmate. The Slap, which uses two male characters engaging in a spanking competition in ways that play heavily on homosexual innuendo, was banned not just in MENA, but in Turkey and parts of Southeast Asia. The scale of these bans means that viewers in certain markets were watching a significantly different show than viewers in uncensored markets. Episodes that constitute some of the most emotionally resonant material in the show's entire run, The Choices being an especially significant example, simply did not exist for large portions of the show's international audience as broadcast content. Turkey's censorship history with the show deserves specific attention because it presents one of the more philosophically interesting cases in the entire record. The Turkish market applied its own set of restrictions that overlapped with the MENA edits in some areas and diverged in others. What makes Turkey particularly notable is the platform asymmetry that resulted. The censored versions of episodes applied only to the televised broadcast on Cartoon Network Turkey. The same episodes, in their full uncensored versions, were simultaneously available on the official Gumball YouTube channel in Turkey and on streaming platforms that operated in that market. This created a situation that is worth sitting with for a moment. Turkish children watching the show on television were receiving an edited, restricted version. Turkish children watching on YouTube or a streaming service were receiving the complete, uncensored original. The censorship was, in a very literal and demonstrable sense, a performance. It satisfied the formal requirements of broadcast standards, while being completely circumvented by any viewer who simply went online. The show existed simultaneously in two different states for the same audience, and the audience had easy access to both. This is not an unusual situation in the streaming era, but the clarity with which it illustrates the gap between broadcast censorship frameworks and actual audience access is striking. The old model of broadcast standards, developed in an era when a television set received one signal from one source, and that signal was the only practical way to access content, simply does not map onto an environment where any viewer with internet access can find the uncensored version in 30 seconds. The censorship machinery continues to operate as if it is effective, while the conditions that made it effective have largely dissolved. The United Kingdom's censorship history with the show surprises many people, largely because the show was made in the United Kingdom. But British broadcast standards are separate from production standards, and the UK version of Cartoon Network operated under regulatory guidelines from Ofcom, the British broadcasting regulator, that imposed specific constraints on violent content in children's programming. The most discussed example is The Fight, an episode that involved a recurring character named the Rotten Cupcake, inflicting various physical indignities on Gumball. The UK broadcast cut this sequence substantially compared to the US version, and the difference between the two versions became one of the most searched topics in the show's fandom. Comparison videos showing the US and UK cuts side by side have been viewed many thousands of times. The United States applied its own specific edits in certain cases, and these reveal something about American broadcast standards' particular anxieties. A scene in which Darwin and Gumball use what is depicted as shock therapy to stop a character from lying was cut from the US broadcast, the justification being that children might imitate the behavior. A reference to bath salts in a joke, the kind of offhand reference that functions as cultural shorthand among adults who are aware of the specific early 2010s controversies involving that substance. They was changed to soap suds in later US reruns, an edit that was implemented specifically in 2019. Someone at some point made a deliberate decision to go back to an existing episode and remove a reference that had been considered too charged in the intervening years. That is the censorship apparatus operating in slow motion, applying standards retroactively to content that had already aired. Australia presents another interesting case in the record. The Australian market applied a specific set of edits that sometimes differed from both the UK and US versions, and Australian fans were occasionally in the unusual position of having access to content that had been cut in one major English-speaking market but retained in another. What this created, across all these different regional versions, was a show that genuinely existed in dozens of different forms depending on where you were watching it. This is, as I mentioned when we first walked through the transcript, that inspired this script style, deeply consonant with the show's own thematic preoccupations. The amazing world of Gumball is obsessed with the question of what a character is when observed versus what they are when not observed. It builds entire episodes around the idea that reality is contingent and malleable and dependent on who is looking. The void erases characters that nobody is paying attention to. The existence of the show's world depends on whether an audience is watching. And the show itself, in its actual material existence in the world, was simultaneously existing in dozens of different states depending on which national audience was observing it. The meta-resonance of that fact is not something I am applying to the show from outside. It is a resonance the show itself would have appreciated and perhaps even intended, given how thoroughly it engaged with questions about the observer's relationship to the observed. The censorship history of the revival series The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball largely mirrors the original show's record. The same markets that applied heavy restrictions to the original series have continued applying comparable standards to the revival, with several episodes being banned from Cartoon Network broadcast in MENA and parts of Southeast Asia for the same categories of content that triggered bans in the original run. Romantic themes, LGBTQ-adjacent content, cross-dressing, and certain categories of physical humor all continue to generate regional restrictions in the same markets where they always did. The practical impact of these restrictions has changed somewhat in the streaming era. As an increasing proportion of the show's audience accesses it through Hulu, Max, Cartoon Network's own digital properties, and various other streaming platforms rather than through cable broadcast, the edited regional versions have become less dominant in terms of what the audience actually sees. The uncensored versions are widely available, but the official broadcast standards in those markets have not changed, and the legacy of the censorship history continues to shape how the show is discussed, what content has been documented, and how the franchise's relationship to different global audiences is understood. Section 4. Hidden in Plain Sight. Every children's show has adult jokes. This is not a controversial observation. The practice of writing content that functions meaningfully for multiple age groups simultaneously dates back at least to the classic theatrical cartoon shorts of the Golden Age and has been a consistent feature of children's entertainment ever since. The understanding that parents accompany children to films and sit with them during television programs, and that these adults deserve to be entertained rather than endured, has shaped children's comedy for nearly a century. But Gumball's relationship with adult humor was not simply about providing a pleasant layer of wit for the parents in the room. It was a sustained, systematic, and clearly intentional creative policy of embedding specifically mature, specifically knowing, specifically sophisticated adult references into a show rated for children as young as 7. The show was not just giving adults something to chuckle at. It was constructing elaborate comedic architecture that operated on two entirely distinct frequencies simultaneously, requiring full knowledge of adult cultural context for one reading and completely functional as absurdist children's comedy without that knowledge. The Banana Joe computer scene has become the reference point for this phenomenon because it is so precisely constructed. In the relevant episode, Gumball walks into Banana Joe's room without knocking. Joe is sitting at his laptop, and on the screen is a video of a live-action orange being slowly and sensuously unpeeled. There is a box of tissues on the desk beside the laptop. Joe's expression when caught is one of shame and horror. Gumball slowly backs out of the room. Children watching this sequence found it funny because the situation of being caught doing something embarrassing on a computer is universally recognizable as comedic. The orange being unpeeled and the horrified reaction are sufficient to generate a laugh without understanding why specifically it might be embarrassing. Adults watching the same sequence understood immediately that what they were looking at was an extended joke about a specific adult activity involving fruit-themed imagery and readily accessible tissues. The construction requires both readings to coexist cleanly. The child's reading must be completely satisfying on its own terms. The adult reading must be unmistakable to anyone who holds the relevant cultural context. Threading that needle requires genuine skill. The eggplant and Allen sequence is another that gets referenced constantly in these discussions, and it merits detailed attention because the comedic engineering is particularly intricate. Allen, who is a balloon character, is attempting to demonstrate to a group of younger students the importance of eating vegetables. He has selected an eggplant for this demonstration. He attempts to fit the eggplant through his inflation valve, which functions as his mouth, with considerable difficulty. The eggplant emoji in digital communication is a universally recognized shorthand for a specific piece of male anatomy, and Allen, attempting to insert it into his body through a specific orifice, while surrounded by children watching with wide eyes, is, for an adult viewer familiar with this shorthand, an extremely specific kind of joke. A child in the audience notices that Allen appears to be talking while eating and wonders aloud where the eggplant went. Before anyone can answer, another child helpfully offers Allen a pineapple, which produces an even more horrified reaction. The joke escalates through a sequence that only functions as written if you understand the adult reading of every element. And yet the surface visual comedy, a balloon struggling to eat a vegetable in an inappropriate way, is entirely sufficient for a 7-year-old viewer who has never encountered the relevant emoji. Gumball's depiction of Mr. Small, the school guidance counselor, is perhaps the most sustained and consistent example of adult content embedded into children's programming in the show's entire run. Mr. Small is established as a hippie, which is itself a cultural category that children can recognize and find amusing without fully understanding its historical associations. But the specific depictions of Mr. Small's habits and lifestyle choices consistently push well beyond the generic hippie characterization into territory that is quite specifically about cannabis use. He offers Gumball and Darwin his herbal infusion, with careful and knowing emphasis on herbal. He describes a specific state of elevated relaxation and altered perception in ways that map precisely onto descriptions of marijuana intoxication. His van, Janus, is a classic hippie vehicle with all of the countercultural associations that implies. His entire therapeutic approach involves states of consciousness that are described in ways that leave adults with a very clear picture of their origin. The show is making these jokes consistently from early in its run through to the final season. It was never flagged by the network's standards department for this material, in a way that resulted in changes or removal. This suggests either that the standards team missed what was happening, that they chose to overlook it, or that they made a determination that the material was sufficiently coded to pass the letter of the rating standard, even if it clearly exceeded its spirit. Any of those possibilities tells you something interesting about how broadcast standards actually operate in practice. The adult joke controversy generated a genuinely interesting split in parental reactions to the show. One significant group of parents discovered the layered comedy structure and found it genuinely enjoyable, becoming fans of the show in their own right as adults who watched it with their children. These parents reported that Gumball was rare among children's programs in actually engaging them rather than simply being tolerated. The show was funny to them, not in a nostalgic or condescending way, but as legitimately well-constructed comedy. Another group of parents, encountering the same material, found it objectionable in principle, even if their children were not understanding the adult references. The argument from this group was not that the children were being harmed by content they did not comprehend, but that normalizing this kind of layered, inappropriate content in children's entertainment was a broader cultural problem, that teaching children to feel included in jokes they could not fully understand was a form of manipulation, even if benign in its intent. This second argument has some philosophical substance to it. There is a legitimate question about whether the comedy structure of knowing winks aimed at adults that pass over children's heads is entirely honest. The children watching are laughing because the visual comedy is doing its job, but they are also implicitly being set up to laugh at things they will later understand differently. And the experience of retrospectively understanding a joke you laughed at as a child without understanding it is a specific kind of cultural initiation whose ethics are genuinely worth examining. The show's defenders, who significantly outnumber its critics on this specific point, tend to emphasize the craft involved. These jokes do not just require adult knowledge to understand. They require genuine skill to construct. The child's reading must work completely, The adult reading must be unmistakable. Both must coexist cleanly in a sequence that cannot telegraph one reading to the audience that holds the other. That is difficult. Most comedy writers attempting it fail on one dimension or the other. Gumball's writers succeeded consistently over 240 episodes, which is a creative achievement worth recognizing regardless of your views on whether the content was appropriate. There is also the deeper category of adult themes in the show, beyond the innuendo and the drug references. The themes that are adult not because they are inappropriate, but because they are genuinely serious. Depression depicted as a literal emptying of the world, existential anxiety about whether your identity is authentic, grief about impermanence, fear of being replaced. These themes exist in the amazing world of Gumball, not as decoration or shock value, but as the show's genuine emotional core. And the question of whether these themes are appropriate for 7-year-olds is a different and more important question than whether Banana Joe's computer should have been edited. The Downer is the episode most cited in discussions of serious adult themes in children's programming. It depicts Gumball experiencing what is clearly and unambiguously a depressive episode, rendered visually as a world that has emptied itself of everyone he knows and loves. He wanders through a Elmore that is silent and colorless. He finds freedom in the emptiness initially, and then finds something much darker, the terror of isolation, the way familiar places become alien without the people who give them meaning, the hollow quality of a world that has gone dark to match your interior state. The episode depicts this with genuine accuracy. It is one of the more honest portrayals of depression in any animated format at any age rating. Whether that honesty is appropriate for a 7-year-old is a question that does not have a clean answer, but it is a question that the show forced its audience to engage with, and forcing that engagement is itself a form of respect for the audience's capacity to handle real things. Section 5. The Miracle Star Plagiarism Saga. This is the story that sounds impossible until you watch the comparison videos. And then it sounds exactly as possible as it clearly was, which tells you something specific and not entirely flattering about a certain category of commercial decision-making. In 2014, a Chinese company called Sanyuan Foods was developing marketing materials for a new line of products, specifically a goat milk product aimed at children. Sanyuan Foods is not a small regional enterprise. It is one of China's significant dairy companies, operating in a national market and dealing with the kind of brand recognition challenges that large food companies face when trying to reach a young demographic. The marketing solution they arrived at was to create an animated series, not a series based on an original property, not a series developed in-house with original characters. A series based very, very closely on something that already existed. The show they created was called Miracle Star, and its relationship to the amazing world of Gumball was not a case of inspired parallel development or even significant creative borrowing. It was scene for scene, character for character, premise for premise copying on a scale that goes beyond what the word imitation can comfortably contain. The main character, Miao Leixing, is an anthropomorphic goat boy who lives with his family, including a talking pet frog. They live in an apartment building. They attend a school populated by diverse anthropomorphic creatures. The family's dynamics, the visual design of the settings, the specific ways that scenes were staged and shot and edited, all of it was derived directly from the Gumball model. The most damning evidence, and the evidence that made the story go viral when it was eventually surfaced online, was the existence of direct scene recreations. Specific sequences from existing Gumball episodes were reproduced in Miracle Star, with the characters replaced by the goat and frog equivalents, but otherwise duplicated in structure, staging, timing, and execution. The same camera positions, the same comic timing, the same visual jokes. These were not scenes inspired by Gumball. They were scenes that required having watched Gumball carefully and then rebuilt them almost exactly. In early 2015, a YouTube user posted a video they titled Chinese Gumball, presenting side-by-side comparisons of Miracle Star sequences and the Gumball episodes they had been taken from. The response was immediate and enormous. The animation community engaged with it intensely. The broader internet found it somewhere between genuinely outrageous and absurdly funny. Ben Bocklett himself became aware of the situation, and his documented response to it was notably measured and even slightly amused, which gives you a useful read on his personality and his confidence in the show's actual quality. He engaged with it publicly without appearing threatened or genuinely angry, which reflects an understanding that a copy of something is not actually a threat to the original thing. The fan community's response was considerably louder than Bocklett's. Gumball fans in 2015 were deeply and emotionally invested in the show, which was at that point in its fourth season and widely considered to be operating at the peak of its creative powers. The discovery that a Chinese dairy company had constructed what was essentially a lesser bootleg version of the thing they loved, dressed it in goat milk branding, and released it without apparent concern for the question of where the ideas had come from, generated a response that moved through several emotional phases. Initial outrage, disgust at the specific degree of copying, then gradual transition into something closer to mockery as the full absurdity of the situation became clear. And eventually a kind of delighted schadenfreude when it emerged that the response from the Gumball production team would be to make an episode about it. Miracle Star was, by most accounts, not a good show even by the standards of promotional animation. The animation quality was lower than Gumball's. The voice acting was described by viewers as below average. The lip-syncing, incredibly, had been derived from the Gumball lip-sync data, which means that in some versions the characters' mouths are not matching the Chinese dialogue, because they were not designed to match Chinese dialogue. The show was cancelled after 12 episodes, reportedly due to negative critical and audience reception. It does not appear to have effectively promoted the goat milk product it was designed to market, which seems like a commercially significant failure for something that presumably cost a meaningful amount of money to produce. The Gumball production team's response was The Copycats, which aired in Season 5, Episode 13 in 2017. The premise of The Copycats is that Gumball and Darwin discover an online video showing a family that earns money by copying everything the Wattersons do or say. This copycat family is visually and conceptually designed as a direct reference to the Miracle Star characters. They wear the same kinds of expressions. Their family dynamics are recognizable, and the show's treatment of them is deliberately, pointedly dismissive. The copycat family is hollow. They do not understand why the things they copy work. They can reproduce the surface behaviors but not the substance beneath them. They make money briefly but cannot sustain it, because there is nothing genuine underneath the imitation. The episode is a diss track in animated form. It is a confident, public humiliation of a company that had believed it could copy the aesthetic of something and capture its value. The show is saying, clearly and without embarrassment, that you can copy everything visible about a creative work and still end up with something that is not the thing. What Gumball is cannot be reproduced from the outside, because what Gumball is lives inside. Interestingly, the episode served double duty as the transition point for the new Gumball voice actor, Nicholas Cantu, taking over from Jacob Hopkins. The voice change was handled at the very end of The Copycats as a brief gag, which many fans felt was underplayed given the narrative significance of these transitions to the show's audience. But the choice to make this particular episode the site of that transition, given that the episode is centrally about what makes something authentic versus what makes something copied, has a specific resonance that is hard to read as accidental. The Miracle Star controversy sits in the broader context of intellectual property and creative appropriation in global animation markets. China's relationship with Western intellectual property has been complex throughout the modern media era, and cases of Chinese productions drawing very heavily from Western creative works are not rare. What made Miracle Star different, what made it a genuine cultural moment rather than just a production footnote, was the scale of the copying and the directness of the Gumball team's public response. Most plagiarism in creative industries is handled through legal channels, through cease and desist letters and rights negotiations and quiet settlements. The Gumball team's choice to handle it through creative means, by making an episode that immortalized the incident in the show's own canon, was unusual and demonstrated a confidence about the show's identity that the plagiarism itself had failed to rattle. The legacy of the Miracle Star situation lives on in how the Gumball fan community talks about authenticity and creative identity. The episode The Copycats has become a touchstone for discussions about what makes a creative work, what it is, why imitation consistently fails to capture value, and what the relationship is between a show's surface aesthetics and its internal substance. Those are interesting questions generated by what was essentially a corporate attempt to sell goat milk through cartoon animals. Section 6. The Joy and the Dark Episode Debates. The Amazing World of Gumball generated more ongoing debate about the appropriateness of dark content in children's animation than almost any other show in its era. This was not because the show was simply dark. Many children's shows have dark moments. It was because Gumball was dark in ways that were sophisticated, intentional, and technically well executed, which made them more unsettling rather than less. A crudely executed dark moment in a children's show feels wrong and clumsy. A brilliantly executed one feels like it is doing something. And the question of what exactly it is doing and whether it should be doing it for the rated audience is a genuine question with no easy answer. The Joy is the episode most people cite first in these discussions, and its reputation is entirely earned. Season 3, Episode 4. The premise begins with Richard giving Gumball and Darwin what he calls a wonder hug, a hug filled with the most concentrated possible expression of parental love and domestic warmth. When the boys arrive at school, something is wrong. They are smiling too widely. Their happiness has intensity and duration beyond what is natural. And soon, anyone they come into contact with, anyone they hug or touch in the right way, begins experiencing the same overcorrected euphoria. The school fills with what Miss Simeon identifies as a joy virus. The infected characters become what the episode calls joy zombies. Permanent dilated grins, dilated pupils, rainbow-colored fluid around the mouth, a specific lurching movement pattern, a compulsive need to find uninfected characters and share the joy with them through physical contact. Miss Simeon, who becomes the episode's unlikely protagonist, has to navigate the infected school to reach the intercom system and broadcast a cure. The cure is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the saddest piece of music she knows, because the joy virus can only be neutralized by genuine sadness. Every element of the episode's construction references zombie horror cinema, specifically and deliberately. The documentary found footage framing of certain sequences, the security camera timestamp graphics, the gradually mounting sense that there is no safe corner, that the infection is spreading faster than containment is possible. The specific way infected characters move, arms outstretched, pursuing the uninfected not with aggression, but with terrible, unblinking affection. The episode cites 28 Days Later and Resident Evil and Quarantine, and Left 4 Dead specifically enough that adult viewers who know those works recognize them immediately. The episode is not horror adjacent. It is horror, executed within the constraints of a children's animation budget and format, but making every creative decision in service of genuine dread. The sequence where Miss Simeon disguises herself as an infected character to navigate a corridor is one of the most technically impressive pieces of comedy horror writing the show produced. She is mimicking the outward signs of infection, arms extended, smile forced, to blend in with the infected crowd around her. She is almost through. And then she sees Banana Joe walking with his peel slightly unzipped, a dress code violation. She has been a teacher for 2 million years, the show has previously told us. She reaches out, she zips his peel. The infected see her. The comedy and the horror arrive simultaneously, and neither cancels the other out. The episode ends without resolution. Miss Simeon is infected. The crisis is not resolved. The screen cuts to a pre-recorded video of Principal Brown doing something silly, and the episode ends. The next episode, the show has reset itself, and the zombie apocalypse is not mentioned. This deliberate choice to not resolve the episode's crisis and to simply let the reset erase it without acknowledgement was one of the most discussed creative decisions in the show's entire run. The Joy's existence as a genuinely disturbing piece of content in a show rated for 7-year-olds generated discussion from parents, critics, and fans about where the appropriate limits of darkness in children's animation lie. The defenders of the episode made several arguments. First, that children who find the episode frightening are still in a completely safe environment while experiencing that fright, which is an argument for the value of safe scares as a developmental experience. Second, that the episode's underlying theme, that weaponized happiness that strips away your autonomy and forces you to be the emotional state someone else decided you should be, is a genuinely important theme for children to encounter. Third, that the horror film craft on display was teaching young viewers something about how visual storytelling works, even if they could not yet articulate what they were learning. Fourth, that the ending without resolution accurately reflects how traumatic experiences are sometimes not resolved, not processed, not acknowledged, but simply buried under the next ordinary day. The critics of the episode made the simpler argument that a zombie apocalypse, however cleverly constructed, was not appropriate content for a 7-year-old Saturday afternoon. That the show was exceeding its rating in ways that represented a failure of content responsibility. And that the deliberate use of horror film grammar was specifically calculated to frighten young children in ways they did not have the emotional scaffolding to process. There is not a clean resolution to this debate, Both sides are making coherent arguments from coherent premises. What can be said with confidence is that The Joy represents the show at its most deliberately transgressive, pushing as far as it could go within its technical constraints towards something that would have been appropriate in an adult horror anthology, and bringing it to children without apology or softening. The Puppets, which served as the season 5 finale, represents a different category of dark content controversy. Rather than the show pushing its own creative limits, The Puppets involved a deliberate collaboration with an external creative entity whose entire body of work was built on horror and the deconstruction of childhood's comforting frameworks. The Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared web series, created by Becky Sloan and Joseph Pelling through their production company Blink Industries, had become one of the most discussed pieces of internet video in the early 2010s, precisely because it used the visual language and cheerful format of children's educational television as the vehicle for deeply unsettling explorations of creativity, conformity, and the suppression of individual thought. It was beloved by a substantial adult audience and was emphatically not made for children. When Gumball announced a collaboration with Sloan, Pelling, and Blink Industries for the season 5 finale, the adult fans of both properties responded with something between excitement and disbelief. This was a very strange match. The season 5 finale of a children's network show was going to be made, in substantial part, by the people behind one of the most disturbing pieces of short-form animation produced for adults in the previous decade. The resulting episode, The Puppets, involves Gumball and Darwin finding old puppet toys from their childhood, becoming consumed by them, and eventually being dragged into a puppet world where the old toys take revenge on the people who had abandoned them years before. The Puppet Dimension segment, running for approximately 5 minutes, was produced in the same physical puppet style as Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, using sets and puppets built specifically for the episode, and was co-written by the DHMIS creators. It includes a song about fun that stops and restarts and asks questions it should not be asking. It includes a tree of permanent happiness that moans that it wishes it could feel other things. It includes the specific uncanny quality of something that looks familiar and safe, but is not. The Puppets generated less controversy than The Joy in terms of parental concern, largely because its horror is more abstract and less viscerally readable for young viewers. A child watching the Puppet segment finds it weird and slightly scary in a way they can process as fun. An adult viewer familiar with Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared finds it considerably more unnerving because they can see exactly what kind of creative territory is being invoked. But the episode was widely praised as a creative achievement and stands as one of the more unusual things Cartoon Network has ever commissioned. A children's show deliberately invoking the grammar and atmosphere of adult horror web content in its season finale. The ongoing debate about dark content in Gumball never reached a definitive conclusion because it was never a debate about whether the content was well made. Everyone involved agreed it was well made. The debate was always about whether well-made dark content belongs in children's programming, and that question does not have a factual answer. It has values-based answers, which means different people hold different positions based on what they believe children can handle and what they believe children's entertainment is for. The show, characteristically, held its position on this throughout its run, without apology or hedging. Section 7. The Inquisition, Cliffhanger, and the Years That Followed. On June 24, 2019, The Amazing World of Gumball aired its final episode of the original run, Episode 44 of Season 6, The Inquisition. Ben Boaklet had announced publicly in September of 2016 that Season 6 would be his last as showrunner, that he had designed a story arc with a natural conclusion, and that completing 6 seasons and then resolving the story through a film was the intended path. He was departing from the show at the point he had always planned to depart. This was not a cancellation. It was a planned ending on the creator's terms. What he had not fully anticipated, or had anticipated but underestimated the emotional resonance of, was how the specific shape of the ending would land with the show's audience. The Inquisition is, in terms of pure narrative mechanics, an extraordinary piece of television. Rob, who has become one of the show's most complex and morally interesting characters over the course of Season 6, has infiltrated the school system disguised as a government inspector. He is using this position to attempt to convert every character in Elmore into a live-action human being. He is essentially trying to smuggle the entire cast of a cartoon into physical reality before the cartoon ends and the void destroys them all. He has understood, from his unique position as the one character who has been inside the void and survived, that the void is cancellation, that the show ending means Elmore ceasing to exist, and that the only way to save the characters he has spent the series trying to escape from, and eventually trying to protect, is to make them real before reality for them is revoked. Gumball and Darwin do not know any of this. They know Rob is the villain. That is his role. He is the bad guy. So they stop him. They celebrate their victory. And then the static begins to seep through the floor. The void arrives. The world starts to come apart at its visual seams. And Rob, who understood what was coming and tried to prevent it and was stopped by the heroes, falls into the void first. He is the first one consumed. The one who tried to save everyone is the first one to be lost. The episode ends in static. There is no resolution. There is no follow-up scene. There is no button that offers comfort or hope. The credits roll and it is over. For fans who experienced this episode without knowing what was coming next, the response was genuinely powerful and not always in a pleasant way. The fan communities in the days and weeks after the Inquisition aired are a record of people moving through stages of reaction, from confusion to grief to anger to a kind of desperate searching for information about what came next. Was the movie real? Was there actually going to be a film? When was it? Who had confirmed it? Where had Bocklet said this? Bocklet did address it publicly after the episode aired, confirming that the cliffhanger had not been his preference for an ending, that the story was not finished, and that he intended to resolve it through a film. This was reassuring, but a statement of intention and an actual film are different things. And the years between 2019 and the eventual resolution of the story through the wonderfully weird world of Gumball were years of uncertainty. February 2021 brought the official announcement of The Amazing World of Gumball movie under working development. September 2021 brought the formal greenlit announcement with the title The Amazing World of Gumball, the movie, and an attachment to HBO Max. The synopsis described a premise involving a real-world fan discovering a missing episode of the show and accidentally creating a portal into Elmore. The film was positioned as both a grand finale for the original series and a launching pad for a continuation. This was what fans had been waiting for. And then August of 2022 arrived, and with it the consequences of the Warner Brothers Discovery merger. Under the new management of David Zaslav, Warner Brothers Discovery made a series of decisions that sent shockwaves through the creative community. Projects that had been announced were canceled. Shows that had been produced and were ready to release were removed from the platform. The Gumball movie was among the casualties of this period. Its HBO Max release canceled as the new management restructured its content priorities. The fan reaction to this development was extensive and genuinely angry, and the anger had a quality different from the disappointment of the Inquisition. The Inquisition's cliffhanger had been a creative choice, something the creator had made deliberately and with a plan for resolution. The cancellation of the movie was an institutional failure, something done to a creative work by people who had not made it and did not appear to fully appreciate what they were handling. The Gumball fan community's relationship with Warner Brothers Discovery in the post-cancellation period was not warm. Bocklet addressed the situation at the Annecy International Animation Film Festival in June of 2024. He confirmed that the project was not dead, that the script remained in development, and that the shape of the project had evolved from what it had originally been. He said the movie was not dead, that there was still a script, still a desire to make it. But he also acknowledged that years of distance had changed his perspective on what the story should be and how it should be told. The Revival series eventually emerged as the vehicle through which the story moved forward. The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball was announced at Annecy in 2023, confirmed in production in December of that year, and premiered on Hulu on July 28, 2025. The season finale, The Rewrite, was announced as the episode that would directly resolve the cliffhanger from the Inquisition. The film concept that had been in development had been adapted and incorporated into the series format. The story of the Inquisition and its aftermath is ultimately a story about the particular vulnerability of serialized, long-form storytelling to forces beyond creative control. Bocklet built something with a specific ending in mind. He designed the structure carefully. He trusted that the institutional support for completing that structure would remain in place. And then the institutional support was reorganized in ways that left the structure incomplete for years. The fact that the resolution eventually arrived through a different door than originally planned represents a kind of victory for the franchise. But the years of uncertainty were genuinely difficult for fans, and the specific corporate decisions that caused them remain Fairly, a point of criticism. Section 8. The Warner Brothers Discovery Situation. In full, it is worth taking a specific pass through the Warner Brothers Discovery situation because it is important context for understanding not just the Gumball movie's fate, but the broader institutional environment in which the show's later history played out. When Warner Brothers and Discovery completed their merger in April of 2022, the resulting company inherited an enormous portfolio of media properties, streaming platforms, and in-development projects. David Zaslav, who took over as CEO, moved quickly to restructure the company's content strategy around what he described as a more financially disciplined approach. The changes that followed were significant enough to generate sustained and intense criticism from the creative community and from audiences. A number of HBO Max original projects were canceled outright, including several that had been publicly announced and had generated audience anticipation. Some completed films were never released. The cancellation of Batgirl, a completed superhero film that had been produced at substantial cost, and its removal from any platform release, became a particularly notorious example of the new regime's approach and generated a level of industry criticism that extended well beyond genre film communities. For animation specifically, the period was particularly turbulent. Cartoon Network, which had been among the most creatively ambitious children's networks in the world for decades, found its institutional identity and creative infrastructure destabilized by the merger's aftermath. A number of Cartoon Network productions were canceled or had their streaming presence reduced. The sense within the animation community was that the new management was not prioritizing the medium or the audience that had made the network what it was. The Gumball movie existed within this environment, in development but not yet completed, attached to a platform that was being restructured. Made by a creator who was navigating an institutional context that had changed significantly from the one in which the project had been commissioned. The decision to cancel the HBO Max release was not accompanied by a public explanation of reasoning that satisfied the creative community or the fan base. It was presented as a business decision, which is true but not especially illuminating about its specific logic. The recovery of the franchise from this period involved institutional changes as well as creative ones. Hanna-Barbera Studios Europe, the renamed version of Cartoon Network Development Studio Europe, became the production home for the Revival series. Hulu became the primary American streaming platform for the Revival's release rather than Max, which represented a meaningful shift in the franchise's platform relationship. The Revival was announced, produced, and delivered within a significantly different institutional structure than the one the original show had operated within. What is notable is that the Revival arrived at all, and arrived in a form that allowed the story to move forward. The specific resolution that the rewrite provided for the Inquisition cliffhanger means that the fans who spent years waiting for the story to continue have, finally, received something. Whether the movie will still eventually be made, whether it will function as a supplement to the story rather than its resolution given that the Revival has handled the resolution, are questions that remain open as of early 2026. Section 9. The Wonderfully Weird World returns. When the teaser trailer for The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball dropped on May 19, 2025, the internet reacted in ways that genuinely surprised the people who made it. Eric Fountain, one of the executive producers of the Revival alongside Ben Bocklett, recalled in subsequent interviews that the level of engagement with the teaser across social media platforms was, in his words, daunting. He described it as seeming like more people had watched the teaser than there were people on Earth, which is a meaningful exaggeration but one that captures the scale of the response. After years of corporate uncertainty and institutional upheaval and unanswered questions about whether the franchise would ever move forward in a meaningful way, the confirmation that new Gumball was actually happening and was apparently being made with genuine care generated a reaction that was equal parts relief and excitement. The Revival was facing specific challenges that were different in kind from the challenges the original show had faced. The original show was building something from scratch, finding its audience through trial and error, establishing its identity across early seasons. The Revival was arriving as a continuation of something that had ended with enormous emotional weight and had been promised a resolution for years. It was being made for an audience that had grown up alongside the original show and had very specific feelings about it. It was bringing in almost entirely new voice cast for the main characters. And it was attempting to demonstrate that the specific qualities that made the original series extraordinary could be sustained after a 6-year gap and a significant institutional transition. On its own terms, the reception of The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball was genuinely strong. The show received a 100% critical score on Rotten Tomatoes based on initial reviews. Fan discourse was broadly enthusiastic, with the majority of responses in the IMDb review section and across Reddit communities, treating the revival as a genuine continuation that honored what the original had built. Streaming performance data from Nielsen indicated that the premiere week attracted 363 million minutes watched, a commercially significant result that placed it 10th among most streamed originals in that period. The voices were the most anxiously anticipated element and the most discussed after premiere. Alcaio Thiele's Gumball was received positively by a majority of fans, with many describing his performance as capturing the character's essential quality without simply imitating the previous actors. Hero Hunter's Darwin was also broadly received well. Although the Darwin voice replacement question has always generated less heat than the Gumball one, because Darwin's voice identity is somewhat more flexible within the character's personality. Teresa Gallagher and Dan Russell returning as Nicole, and Richard gave the cast 2 anchor points of genuine continuity that felt important symbolically as well as practically. The internal fan debates about the revival's quality focused on a few specific points. Some longtime fans, particularly those most invested in the show's philosophical and meta-narrative depth, they felt that the early episodes of the first batch leaned somewhat more heavily on episodic situational comedy and somewhat less on the sustained examination of the show's existential themes that the later original seasons had prioritized. This is a defensible reading of the first batch of episodes, and it is also worth noting that structuring a revival season to ease viewers back in through the familiar before re-engaging with the more demanding material is a reasonable creative choice. The rewrites' promised return of Rob and the Void to the season's conclusion suggests that the deeper thematic currents were always intended to resurface at the right moment, rather than dominate from the first episode. The Skibidi toilet moment in the second season generated its own small controversy among fans who felt the reference was beneath the show's usual comedic standards. This is a matter of taste rather than a genuine ethical concern, but it reflects the community's ongoing vigilance about whether the revival is maintaining the specific quality that made the original valuable, rather than drifting toward more immediately topical and ephemeral humor. The original Gumball's cultural references tended to have a quality of careful selection and internal logic that made them land on multiple levels simultaneously. A Skibidi toilet joke, however well executed, is by definition a reference whose cultural shelf life is measured in months rather than years. The second season was released all at once on December 22, 2025, and while the critical response remained positive, the fan community's reactions were more granular and more mixed than they had been for the first batch of episodes. Some episodes were celebrated as among the best the franchise had ever produced. Others were felt to be lighter or more inconsistent. The range of quality within a single batch of episodes is not unusual for any long-running animated series, but the high expectations created by the franchise's reputation made inconsistencies more noticeable. The announcement in December of 2025 that the revival had been renewed for a third and fourth season ahead of the second season's premiere is the clearest institutional signal of the franchise's current health. That kind of early, pre-premiere renewal does not happen for properties that are not generating confidence at the platform and studio level. The combination of streaming performance, critical reception, and fan engagement had positioned The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball as a genuine success, which gives Ben Bocklett and his team the space and security to take the kinds of creative risks that the original show's legacy demands. The revival also carries forward the original show's censorship situation. The same regional broadcast standards that generated bans and heavy edits for the original series continue to apply in the same markets for the revival. Episodes dealing with romantic themes between characters, content that reads as LGBTQ inclusive, and cross-dressing character presentations have been banned from Cartoon Network broadcast in MENA and certain Southeast Asian markets, echoing the patterns established across the original 6 seasons. The practical impact of these restrictions has shifted somewhat as streaming access has expanded, but the policies themselves have not changed, and the show continues to exist in multiple different versions in different parts of the world. Section 10. The Grand Unified Controversy. We have been at this for a long time now. The room is almost certainly much darker than when we started. Your breathing has probably settled into something slower and deeper. The noise outside, if there was any, has likely thinned out to almost nothing, This is exactly where we want to be for this final section, because the final section is about the big picture, the through line that connects everything we have covered tonight and gives it meaning that extends beyond the individual incidents. Every controversy in the history of the amazing world of Gumball, no matter how specific its surface content, is ultimately about the same question. What is a children's show actually allowed to do? Not in the regulatory sense, the TVY7 rating sense, but in the deeper sense. What does it owe its audience? How much can it ask of the people watching it? How honest is it permitted to be about things that are genuinely difficult? How dark can it go while maintaining its commitment to the audience it was made for? And what does it become when it decides that the answer to all of these questions is more than you might expect? Ben Bocklett built The Amazing World of Gumball out of rejected things. That origin story is the foundation of everything the show became. Characters that had failed in other contexts, that had been declared insufficient for the work they were designed for, gathered together in a world built from photographs of a real city and asked to tell stories that the format they occupied was not supposed to be capable of. Every controversy the show generated was a controversy about whether it had exceeded its remit, whether it was trying to be more than a children's cartoon should be. The answer to that question, stated as simply as possible, is yes. It was always trying to be more. That was the point from the beginning. From the first creative decision to assemble rejected characters, and the second creative decision to wrap their story in a format that would let you sneak past every gatekeeping impulse and talk about the things you actually wanted to talk about. The show about a blue cat and a talking goldfish was always going to be about existential fear and the terror of being forgotten, and the way identity is constructed, and the possibility that your entire world might be a fiction that someone else controls. The cat and the fish were always going to be the vessel for that, not the content of it. The censorship battles reveal a world that disagrees sharply about what children need protection from, but agrees that they need protection. The adult joke controversy reveals a team that trusted their young audience more than the rating framework assumed. The voice actor changes reveal what happens when a show outlasts the biological constraints of its cast, and what it means for a show obsessively about identity to keep replacing the voices that carry its main characters. The Miracle Star situation reveals how deeply the fan community had internalized a sense of cultural ownership over the show. The dark episode debates reveal a sustained disagreement about the difference between a children's show that respects children enough to be honest with them about difficult things, and a children's show that simply ignores what its audience can handle. The Inquisition controversy reveals how seriously the show's fans took its philosophical commitments. You do not get that angry about an unresolved cliffhanger unless you genuinely believe the story had something profound to finish saying and were devastated at the prospect of it going unsaid. The Warner Brothers Discovery situation reveals the specific ways that institutional power can interfere with the relationship between a creative work and the audience that loves it. And the revival reveals what it looks like when a show returns after years of absence, carrying the weight of enormous accumulated expectation, and manages to honor that expectation while also demonstrating that it still has things left to say. The show about characters who exist only as long as someone is watching them turned out to be exactly that kind of show in its real-world existence as well. The void almost closed. The static almost won. The institutional forces that govern these things were pointed in directions that made completing the story seem genuinely impossible for a period. And then, the signal came back. The story continued. New voices carried old characters through new situations. And the audience that had waited, that had kept the discussion alive, and the community present through the years when nothing new was happening, found that their waiting had mattered. Rob was right about the void. He was right that the signal degrades and the static grows, and the only defense against oblivion is staying interesting, staying real, staying worth watching. But he could not see all the way to the end, to the part where the signal comes back after years of static. That part happens sometimes. That part is happening now. The Amazing World of Gumball is, as of this writing, in active production in multiple forms, renewed for additional seasons of the revival, with a movie still somewhere in development, with a global audience that is watching it across more platforms and in more countries than it was when it first aired on a cable network for Saturday morning children. The show that was built from rejected characters. The show that was almost too sad to be allowed. The show that was made for children but never condescended to them is still there. The controversies in its history are part of why it is still there. A show without controversies is a show without ambition. The fights the show had, with censors and corporations and critics, and the limits of its own format, are the record of a creative team that refused to make something smaller than what they believed it could be. That refusal is the whole story. Every part of what we have covered tonight comes back to it. The show reached further than it was supposed to. It got into trouble for it. It kept reaching anyway. That is what the remarkable shows do. That is what separates the ones that last from the ones that simply air. If you have stayed with this until the end, genuinely, thank you. That means more than I can adequately say in a sign-off. This channel exists because people care about these stories deeply enough to spend time with them. If you are not yet subscribed and you want to make sure these deep dives keep finding their way to you, please subscribe. It takes almost no time, and it is the most useful thing you can do to support what we do here. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like as well. It helps the algorithm understand who should hear about this channel. And tell us down in the comments where you are right now. What time is it? What is the room like? We will be reading every one of those responses, and we love hearing about where these scripts end up in the world. Sleep well. Elmore is still out there. The signal is holding. Watterson Lore, youtube.com/@WattersonLore. Extended section. The broader animation context. To fully appreciate why the Gumball controversies matter in the way they do, it helps to understand where the show sits within the broader history of what Cartoon Network was doing in the 2010s. The network in that decade was in the middle of a creative renaissance. Adventure Time was rewriting what serialized children's fantasy could accomplish. Regular Show was doing its own version of adult humor embedded in a children's format. Steven Universe was handling identity and emotional processing with a depth that regularly outpaced what prestige drama was doing. And The Amazing World of Gumball was operating simultaneously alongside all of those, doing something different from all of them, and in certain respects doing something more philosophically ambitious than any of them. What set Gumball apart from its network siblings was the specific nature of its meta-awareness. Adventure Time played with its mythology and built elaborate cosmological structures. Regular Show used adult cultural references as comedic scaffolding. Steven Universe was deeply invested in emotional processing and relationship drama. Gumball was doing something that none of them were doing in quite the same way, which was turning the entire apparatus of television production, the concepts of ratings and cancellation and audience attention, and format constraints and episodic resets, into the literal subject matter of the show. Not as a background condition that the show operated within, but as the diegetic reality that the characters themselves were negotiating. Rob's arc, which is the show's most sustained exploration of this territory, is also the arc that most clearly demonstrates why the show generated the philosophical controversies it did. When Rob becomes aware that he is in a television show, that his existence is contingent on being watched, that the void is what happens when nobody is paying attention, he becomes the show's most direct expression of what was always its central anxiety. And that anxiety is not about a fictional character in a cartoon. It is about every creative work that depends on audience attention to continue existing. It is about every story that can only remain alive as long as someone cares about it. It is about the relationship between creation and consumption that sits underneath all of media. The Gumball controversies, viewed in this light, are not just arguments about content appropriateness. They are arguments about what it means for a creative work to take itself seriously. The censorship battles are arguments about whether the show should be allowed to engage honestly with the full range of human experience in a format ostensibly designed for children. The adult joke controversy is an argument about whether children deserve to be in the audience for sophisticated comedy, even if they cannot fully access all of what makes it sophisticated. The voice actor debates are arguments about whether the identity of a creative work persists through changes in the specific voices carrying it. The Miracle Star situation is an argument about whether authenticity can be transferred or whether it is permanently attached to the creative decisions that generated it. These are not small arguments. They are arguments about the nature of creative works and their relationship to their audiences, and the fact that they were generated by a cartoon about a blue cat and his adopted goldfish brother is precisely the point. Gumball always insisted that the question of what something is worth does not depend on the format in which it appears. A children's animated series can ask the same questions that literary fiction asks. A show rated for 7-year-olds can deal honestly with depression and existential fear and the terror of oblivion. The format does not determine the content. The content is what the creators decide to put into it. That insistence is what made the show controversial. And that insistence is what made it great. Extended section: the fan community and its role. No account of Gumball's controversies is complete without addressing the role of the fan community, because in several of the show's most significant moments, the fan community was not just an audience for the controversy, but an active participant in it. The Gumball fan community is an unusual one in several respects. It is an international community, reflecting the show's genuinely global reach and its multiple translation and dubbing markets. It includes people who encountered the show as children and have grown into adults who engage with it analytically and critically. It includes people who came to the show later as adults and found its philosophical density surprising and compelling. And it includes people across a very wide age range who simply found it funny and delightful and kept watching because the comedy was consistently excellent. What this community did, particularly in the years between the Inquisition and the Revival, was keep the show alive. Not in a passive sense, but in an active one. Fan theories were developed and shared and debated with genuine rigor. The online wikis for the show are among the most comprehensive and carefully maintained in animation. Analysis videos, including the extended essay video from which this script draws its tonal inspiration, were produced and shared and accumulated enormous view counts. The show's cultural presence during the years when it was not producing new content was maintained almost entirely by a community that had genuinely internalized what made it valuable and wanted to continue examining it. This is not common. Most children's shows, when they stop producing new content, see their fan activity decrease proportionally and quickly. The conversation moves to whatever is currently airing. The cultural energy disperses. Gumball did not follow this pattern. The conversation continued. The analyses deepened. The theories became more elaborate. The community's engagement with the existing material actually intensified during the gap years, partly because people who had been children when the show aired were now adults, with more analytical frameworks for engaging with it, and they were finding new dimensions in something they had first encountered at an age when they could not have fully appreciated everything it contained. The community's emotional investment in the franchise was the pressure that eventually helped create conditions for the revival. The audience attention that kept the property viable during years when no new content was being produced was the product of exactly the dynamic the show had always been exploring. The characters existed because people were watching. The void was held at bay because the fans kept the signal alive. The show about characters who depend on audience attention for their continued existence was, quite literally, kept alive by audience attention. When the revival was announced and eventually released, the fan community's response included specific engagement with the question of whether it honored what the original had built. This is a community that knows the source material exceptionally well, and has thought about it carefully, and has strong views about what it is and what it should be. The debates about voice casting, about the Skibbity toilet reference, about whether certain episodes match the quality of the original run, are all debates being conducted by people who have done the intellectual work of genuinely understanding what they are comparing things to. This level of fan engagement is itself part of the Gumball story, part of what makes the franchise's history unusual and worth telling at length. The show created an audience that cared about it in a specific and demanding way, an audience that engaged with its ideas rather than just its surface entertainment, and that audience became part of the show's ongoing story in the years between the original run and the revival. They were Rob, in a sense. They understood what was at stake. They kept watching. They held the void at bay. Extended section. The animation style as controversy. One dimension of the Gumball story that is often noted, but perhaps not fully explored, is the way the show's visual approach was itself a kind of argument, and occasionally a controversy in its own right. The deliberate visual incoherence of the show, the fact that every character was designed in a different visual idiom and rendered in a different technique, was a creative choice that broke with nearly every convention of how animated series are supposed to look. Animation, as a medium, traditionally prizes visual consistency. The aesthetic unity of a show's design is considered part of its identity. Characters should look like they belong in the same world. The backgrounds and the characters should feel like they came from the same visual imagination. This is a principle so deeply embedded in animation practice that most viewers would not even articulate it as a principle. It simply feels wrong when it is violated. Gumball violated it with complete intentionality and built its entire visual identity out of the violation. The mixed media approach was not a mistake or a budget compromise. It was the point. Every character looking like they came from a different show is an expression of the premise. These are rejected characters from different commercial pitches who have ended up together in a world they were not designed for. The visual dissonance is the world. This approach generated specific controversies in certain markets, where the mixed media aesthetic was unfamiliar or read as production error rather than artistic choice. Some early reviews of the show in non-English speaking markets referenced the visual inconsistency as a flaw before the critical discourse caught up with what the show was actually doing. The photographic backgrounds, in particular, created an uncanny quality in those markets that use animation styles, with no tradition of mixing photography with drawn animation, making the show read initially as strange, in ways that went beyond the show's intentional strangeness. Within the Anglophone fan community, the visual style eventually became one of the show's most celebrated qualities. The specific character of each visual idiom, the fact that you can identify exactly what kind of animation tradition each character comes from, became a layer of analysis that added to the show's intellectual engagement. The CGI characters live in a different phenomenological register than the 2D characters. The clay characters have a weight that the drawn characters do not. The live-action characters, most dramatically Sussy with her upside-down human chin, exist in a relationship to physical reality that the animated characters simply cannot access. These differences are not incidental. They are the show's visual argument about the hierarchies of existence in Elmore, about which characters have more or less claim to material reality, about the relationship between the animated world and the live-action world that the show is always obliquely pointing toward. The argument that the visual style makes is the same argument the narrative makes. Reality in Elmore is not uniform. Different beings occupy different degrees of realness, different modes of existence, different relationships to the underlying logic of the world they all share. Tina Rex being CGI is not an aesthetic quirk. It is an ontological statement. She exists in a different dimension of reality than Gumball. And Sussy being literally a human chin is the most extreme version of this. A character who exists in a fundamentally different category of existence from everyone else in the show, which the show uses as a statement about the thinness of the boundary between the cartoon world and the world the audience inhabits. This is the level at which the show consistently operated. Its controversies were always controversies about a show that was doing more than shows are supposed to do, making arguments through every element of its construction, in forms that ranged from obvious to subtle to deeply hidden in the production design. The censorship fights and the adult joke debates were about what the show said explicitly. The visual style controversy was about what the show was saying without ever quite putting it into words. Extended section. The legacy question. What does the amazing world of Gumball's legacy look like, assessed from the vantage point of 2026 with the revival in its second season and the franchise clearly in good health? The legacy is, primarily, a demonstration of what is possible when the people making children's entertainment refuse to accept the limitations that convention assigns to the format. Every convention Gumball broke, and it broke nearly all of them in some way at some point, was broken in service of making something that its intended audience would genuinely benefit from encountering, not just be entertained by. The distinction between entertainment and genuine engagement is real, and Gumball chose genuine engagement consistently. The show changed how a generation of viewers thought about animation as a medium. People who grew up watching Gumball came to understand that animated shows can do the things that literature does. That format does not determine depth, that a show can make you laugh, and make you think, and make you feel genuinely unsettled all in the same 11-minute segment, and that none of those things cancel the others out. This is a meaningful shift in cultural expectations, and Gumball was one of the primary vehicles through which it happened for the audience that came of age with it. The show also demonstrated something about the sustainability of creative ambition. Gumball maintained its philosophical and comedic ambition across 240 episodes and 6 seasons, which is an enormous run for any show and an extraordinary one for any show operating at the level of creative complexity the later Gumball seasons achieved. Sustaining that quality while managing censorship battles across 30 markets, voice actor changes multiple times, corporate relationships with a network undergoing its own institutional shifts, and the constant pressure of producing content on a television schedule, without allowing any of those constraints to reduce the ambition, is a production achievement that deserves more acknowledgement than it typically receives. The controversies are part of the legacy, not despite themselves, but as themselves. The censorship record documents the show's global reach and the genuine differences in cultural standards across its audience. The adult joke debates document the show's unusual relationship with its multi-generational audience. The voice actor history documents the specific biological and institutional realities of producing long-running children's animation. The Miracle Star story documents the show's cultural penetration into global markets. The Inquisition and its aftermath document what happens when ambition intersects with institutional power, and what it means for a story to survive that intersection. The franchise continues. The revival is in its second season. Renewals for third and fourth seasons have been announced. The movie may yet arrive in some form. The characters exist, for now, in the best possible sense, because people are still watching, the signal is still strong, and the void has not won. That is the whole story. All of it. Every controversy, every triumph, every institutional failure and creative recovery. The show built from rejected things that refused to stay rejected. The show that pushed against every fence it encountered and kept pushing. The show about a blue cat and a talking goldfish that turned out to be one of the most honest and intelligent things in the history of children's television. Rest now. You have spent a long time with something worth the time you gave it. The show is still out there. It always will be, in the ways that matter. And so will this conversation about what it was and what it meant. Thank you for staying, genuinely. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment with where and when you are watching this, and sleep well. Good night, wherever you are. Watterson Lore, youtube.com/@Watterson Lore. Extended section, the Elmore economy and the deeper controversies nobody discusses. There is a cluster of Gumball controversies that get less attention than the censorship debates and the plagiarism story, but that tell you something important about how the show engaged with the world it was making. These are the economic and labor controversies buried inside the fiction of Elmore itself. Consider Larry Needlemeyer, who works 38 jobs simultaneously and never sleeps, earning $7 an hour across every service position in Elmore. The show's treatment of Larry is consistently comedic. He is the running gag character who appears in every location because someone has to staff every location. But when you pull back and look at what the show is actually doing with this character, what you find is a sustained meditation on the economics of necessary labor that is unusually pointed for a children's cartoon. Larry works every job in town because if he stops working any of them, the infrastructure of the town collapses. His labor is absolutely essential. His compensation is at or below minimum wage. He never rests. He cannot, because the consequences of his rest are not personal but communal. He has been trapped by his own essentialness into a form of permanent involuntary service. The episode where Larry quits, the pizza, makes this explicit in ways that moved several critics to describe it as one of the most direct commentaries on labor exploitation in children's television. When Larry finally reaches the end of his patience and walks off all 38 jobs simultaneously, Elmore immediately descends into chaos. Society collapses. Infrastructure fails. People begin behaving in increasingly desperate ways as the systems that made ordinary life possible disappear. And the resolution of the crisis involves Larry being essentially guilted or pressured into returning to work, the implicit argument being that because his labor is so necessary, he is not allowed to withhold it. This is a description of a worker who is trapped by the fact that his work is too valuable. His essentialness is his imprisonment. The society that benefits from his labor has no structural mechanism for fairly compensating it, or for allowing him to rest, or for giving him any leverage in negotiations about his working conditions, because the threat of his withdrawal is too destabilizing for anyone to seriously contemplate. Children watching the pizza see a funny episode about Elmore falling apart without Larry. Adults watching it see a specific and uncomfortable argument about how labor markets treat workers whose skills or positions are genuinely irreplaceable. This reading generated some minor controversy in animation criticism circles, particularly in pieces that argued the show was doing political commentary beneath the surface of its children's entertainment format. Whether Ben Bocklett and his writing staff intended the Larry material as specific commentary on labor exploitation, or whether the argument emerged from the internal logic of the world they were building is impossible to say. Definitively, what is clear is that the argument is there, fully formed, in the text of the episodes, and that children watching the show were being exposed to a worldview about labor and exploitation that most explicitly, political children's programming would not dare articulate directly. Similar arguments can be made about the Masami storyline and the implicit class commentary in how her family's wealth is depicted. Masami's father owns the rainbow factory where Nicole works. The Yoshida family's wealth is so substantial that it essentially forms the economic foundation of the town. Masami can destabilize the weather with her emotional states. Her family has converted economic power into a kind of ontological security that other characters do not have. In a world where the void takes the poor and the boring and the irrelevant, the wealthy have purchased their permanence through ownership rather than through performance. They do not need to be entertaining. They just need to continue owning things. This is not a subtle argument. In a show whose central anxiety is about the relationship between value and existence, depicting wealth as a form of exemption from that anxiety is a pointed observation about how power operates in the world outside the cartoon. The children watching Gumball are being shown, through the medium of Cloud Girl and her all-powerful father, that the existential rules governing everyone else in Elmore do not apply to the people who own the infrastructure. This is a political argument wrapped in children's entertainment. It generated less controversy than the adult jokes or the dark episodes because it was never made fully explicit, but it is part of the record of what the show was doing beneath its surface. The Richard controversy, in the same economic register, is about what happens to a person whose value to the social structure is precisely their non-participation in it. Richard's role in Elmore is essentially to not work. The universe enforces this through the literal fabric of reality, tearing apart when he attempts employment. His cosmic function is to be present but not productive in any conventional economic sense. And the show makes the case, quietly but consistently, that this role, the role of the person who is simply there and warm and available, is valuable in ways that the productive economy does not measure or reward. This is an argument that a lot of people who have felt undervalued by conventional metrics of productivity will recognize and respond to. It is also an argument that the economic controversy around Richard was always really an argument about how we assess what counts as a contribution and who gets to decide. Richard is not failing at life. He is succeeding at something that the dominant framework refuses to call success. That is a radical argument, even if it arrives in the form of a lazy pink rabbit eating sandwiches in front of the television. Extended section: The Dark Theories, Canon, and Community Consensus. A final area worth addressing is the relationship between the show's official canon, the dark theories that the fan community has developed around that canon, and the degree to which the show itself has endorsed, denied, or remained deliberately ambiguous about those theories. The rich tradition of Gumball fan theory is itself a cultural phenomenon that says something important about the show's design. The theories are not arbitrary. They are not the kind of reach that takes a small piece of incidental evidence and constructs an elaborate edifice on top of it. The best Gumball fan theories, the ones about Rob's existential awareness, about the nature of the void as cancellation, about the relationship between the show's visual style and its characters' ontological status, are all built directly from things the show itself explicitly says or visually demonstrates. The theories are not imported from outside the text. They are drawn out of it by close attention and careful reasoning. The controversy around these theories is not about whether they are defensible. Most of them are quite clearly defensible, and some of them are essentially confirmed by the canonical text of the show. The controversy is about what it means for a children's show to have these dimensions at all, to be generating serious philosophical analysis from its fan community, to be read as making arguments about the nature of fictional existence and audience power, and the economics of entertainment that most children's television would not dare approach. Ben Bocklett has maintained a position on the fan theories that is deliberately opaque. When asked directly about the theory that the void represents cancellation and that the character's continued existence depends on audience attention, he has declined to confirm or deny, saying only that he has his own theory about what the show is and what the void means, and that he chooses not to reveal it. This is a very specific kind of authorial restraint, the choice to protect the interpretive openness of the work rather than closing it down with a definitive statement. It is also a choice that respects the intelligence and creative investment of the fan community by refusing to tell them what they are supposed to be getting from the text they have engaged with so carefully. This restraint is itself part of the show's legacy. Gumball is one of the few children's shows that has generated the kind of sustained, serious interpretive engagement that is usually reserved for literature. The theories are not juvenile or reaching. They are careful readings of a text that supports multiple interpretations. The creator's refusal to adjudicate between them is a form of respect for what the work has become in the hands of the people who love it. The final controversy, then, is this one: the controversy of taking a children's show seriously. of treating it as art, as philosophy, as something worth analyzing with the tools we bring to things that are supposed to be for adults. Gumball has always provoked this controversy because it has always insisted that taking it seriously was the right response. It was never coy about its ambitions. It was never apologetic about trying to do something more than its format demanded. It trusted its audience, including its youngest audience, to receive more than they were being officially expected to receive. That trust, maintained across 240 episodes and now extending into a revival that has been renewed through a fourth season, is the deepest and most significant thing in the franchise's history. Not the censorship battles, not the plagiarism story, not the corporate mishaps, the trust. The consistent, unwavering trust that the people watching deserve to be given something worth their time and attention and care. That trust is what all the controversies were really about. And it is what the show's legacy will ultimately rest on, when all the specific incidents have faded, and what remains is the work itself, still there, still generating meaning, still trusting the people who find their way to it. Sleep well, that is everything there is to say. Watterson Lore, youtube.com/@WattersonLore. Extended section, the missing episodes and regional ghosts. There is one more layer to the censorship and controversy history that deserves space, and that is the specific phenomenon of what might be called the regional ghosts of Gumball's broadcast history. These are episodes, or portions of episodes, that exist differently in different markets, to such a degree that depending on where you first encountered the show, your understanding of it is meaningfully different from someone who encountered it in a different market. The most striking example of this is the substantial number of episodes that were banned outright in certain markets, but aired completely normally in others. An episode that was standard viewing for a child in the United Kingdom or the United States might simply not exist for a child watching in the Middle East or Southeast Asia. Not edited, not shortened, simply not there. The show's narrative continued without it, which means that certain story beats, character developments, and tonal moments simply did not exist for large portions of the international audience. This creates a specific kind of cultural fragmentation that is unusual even for a globally distributed show. When fans in different countries discuss the show online, they are sometimes discussing different shows. An episode that was foundational for one viewer, that shaped their understanding of a character or a relationship or a thematic concern, simply did not exist in the viewing experience of another fan from a different market. The community that gathered around the show online was therefore a community with significantly different access to the source material, trying to have conversations about something that was not the same thing for all of them. The Choices episode, which many fans consider one of the finest pieces of storytelling in the show's entire run, was banned in the Middle East and North Africa market. This means that a substantial number of the show's international viewers never had access to the backstory of Nicole and Richard's relationship during the show's original broadcast run. The episode that most fully explains Nicole as a character, that gives her rage and perfectionism and superhuman competence, genuine biographical context, simply did not exist in their version of the show. Their Nicole was a character without an origin. Their understanding of why she is the way she is was necessarily incomplete in a specific and significant way. The Darwin and Carrie relationship episodes, which were banned in several markets for romantic content, created a similar gap. For viewers in those markets, Darwin's relationship with Carrie was either invisible or very incomplete. The tenderness and the impossibility of their situation, which the English-language fan community had full access to, simply did not exist in the version of the show those viewers received. Their emotional relationship to those characters was necessarily shaped by absence rather than presence. These absences are controversies in themselves, even if they never generated the kind of public discussion that the adult jokes or the voice actor changes did. They represent a form of cultural access inequality that is worth naming. The show that was trying to be honest about the full range of human experience was, for a substantial portion of its international audience, a much more limited show than the one its creators made. The ambition was present in the original. It simply did not travel equally. The streaming era has reduced the practical impact of this inequality, but it has not eliminated it. The show continues to be censored in its broadcast versions in certain markets. And while streaming platforms provide access to uncensored versions for viewers who know to look, not all viewers do know. And not all viewers have equal access to international streaming platforms. The inequality persists in diminished form. The regional ghosts are fainter than they once were, but still present in the official broadcast record of the show. The controversy of unequal access is a quiet one. It does not generate the same heat as the plagiarism story or the cliffhanger debate. But it is perhaps the most systemic controversy in the show's history, affecting the largest number of viewers in the most direct way. Millions of people around the world watched a version of The Amazing World of Gumball that was missing significant chunks of what made it what it was. They loved what they had access to, and they never knew exactly what they were missing, which is its own kind of sadness about a show that tried so hard to be complete. The remedy, such as it exists, is streaming. The uncensored show is available. The full text of what was made is accessible to anyone who knows where to find it. The regional ghosts of the broadcast era are being gradually exorcised by the universal access that streaming platforms represent, even if imperfectly and not yet completely. And the revival series, arriving in an era when streaming is more dominant than broadcast for the kinds of audiences Gumball reaches, has a better chance of being the same show for all its viewers than the original run ever could be. That is a meaningful change. It does not undo the history, but it changes the conditions for everything that comes next. And everything that comes next for The Amazing World of Gumball appears, right now, to be more and better and more honest than what came before. Which is exactly what a show about rejected things, finding a home and becoming something magnificent, has always been pointing toward. That really is everything now. Sleep well. Watterson Lore. YouTube.com/@WattersonLore. There is one thing worth saying before we fully close out tonight. The Amazing World of Gumball is, at its core, a show about what happens when things that were told they were not good enough find each other and build something extraordinary together. Ben Bocklett spent years making characters that nobody wanted. He gathered them up when he finally had the chance, put them in a world built from real photographs and mismatched art styles, and his own family's names, and made something that has outlasted every prediction about what a children's animated series could accomplish. The controversies in this history are all, in one way or another, conflicts between that ambition and the forces that wanted to limit it. The censors, who wanted the show to be smaller. The corporations that wanted it to be more profitable. The critics who wanted it to stay in its lane. The bad faith imitators who wanted to harvest its value without doing the creative work. All of them, in their different ways, were trying to limit something that had no interest in being limited. The show won, not in every individual battle, but in the only way that ultimately matters. It made something real, something that people have carried with them through years of their lives. Something that a community continues to tend and analyze and argue over and love. Something that came back after years of absence and was welcomed home. The void did not win. The signal held. Good night.